The most commonly accepted definition of hyperinflation is a month-over-month inflation rate of 50%. Venezuela meets this criteria for hyperinflation. The Venezuelan bolivar is losing purchasing power at 686% per year, which equals a monthly inflation rate of 57%. Sudan is approaching hyperinflation as well, with a yearly inflation rate of 340%. Which translates to around 28% month-over-month inflation. The United States is still far from experiencing hyperinflation. Although the year-over-year inflation rate increased dramatically from 1.2% to 7% between October 2020 and January 2022, it would need to reach 600% to be classified as hyperinflation. This is why it is relatively unlikely that we will see hyperinflation in the United States in the next few years. But it's important to remember that during hyperinflation, the inflation rate increases exponentially. It can happen a lot faster than expected. In 2013, the year-over-year inflation rate of Venezuela was 56%, as reported by the Central Bank of Venezuela. In 2018, it reached 130,000%. On the other hand, the International Monetary Fund expected Venezuela's hyperinflation to be at 39% in 2013 and 929,790% in 2018. That's a huge increase in just 5 years. And as we have seen, there is no reason to believe the United States is immune to fast, unexpected inflation increases. Venezuela's conflicting inflation numbers illustrate another problem. Inflation rates are hard to measure. There are different methods of estimating and measuring inflation. The U.S. government and Federal Reserve, and anyone else for that matter, don't know the true inflation numbers. And even if they did, in an attempt to prevent inflation expectations from getting out of hand, governments would have a bias towards underreporting inflation numbers or downplaying them if they are higher than expected. Influencing the public narrative is one way governments try to keep the lid on inflation. Some alternative measurements suggest that true inflation in the United States is closer to 15% per year. Zimbabwe experienced one of the worst periods of hyperinflation between 2007 and 2008. The Zimbabwean dollar reached an inflation rate of 79,600,000,000% per month in November 2008. 2 decades before, in 1988, the year-to-year inflation rate was only at 7%. Zimbabwe's inflation rate increased slightly but remained relatively steady for the next 2 decades. And then it started going up exponentially between 2007 and 2008. Similarly, a loaf of bread cost around 160 marks in Weimar, Germany at the end of 1922. A few months later, as hyperinflation went parabolic, the price of a loaf of bread increased to 200 billion marks. Given that the year-to-year inflation rate of the United States is reported to be 7%, and the true inflation rate could be much higher, it begs the question whether the United States might experience hyperinflation in the next few decades. It further sparks the question whether all government-issued fiat currencies eventually end up being worthless. This modern monetary experiment, where governments issue fiat currencies that aren't backed by anything but faith and can create as many units of the currency as they want, is a blip in history. It might take another decade or 2, or even a century, before we fully understand the impacts of this monetary experiment, given the increased government spending and more aggressive money printing that followed the Great Recession, and more recently, the health crisis. The question remains whether incidences of hyperinflation such as reported in Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela are simply a taste of what history has in stock for many other countries in the next few decades. There is a clear correlation between money supply and inflation. Many countries have expanded the money supply steeper and more aggressively than ever before in response to the health crisis. While the United States is still far away from hyperinflation, it's probably not a bad idea to be prepared for the worst. Stocks, gold, and scarce commodities have historically proven to be a decent hedge against hyperinflation. While it's hard to preserve wealth in times of hyperinflation, there are always profiteers and people that position themselves in a way that allows them to benefit from the currency collapse. A collapse of the US dollar would have much more far-reaching consequences than any past hyperinflation, because of the US dollar's status as world reserve currency. The ripple effects would likely lead to a global crisis of unimaginable scale. Bitcoin, due to its limited supply, deflationary nature, and decentralized network, should be part of every investor's portfolio. Apart from that, food shortages are common during hyperinflation, so for those who want to go full-on apocalyptic, having a small piece of farmland or a garden with water supply and a way to grow your own food might protect from the more ugly sides of hyperinflation. Even if you hold stocks, gold and Bitcoin, and they skyrocket in value. If supply chains are disrupted, supermarket shelves are empty, and nearby farmers are hoarding their produce, you might be grateful for having your own food garden or farmland. That being said, periods of hyperinflation usually don't last very long. Most historic periods of hyperinflation were quick and nasty. Inflation accelerates exponentially, leading to a temporary economic collapse and an eventual currency reset. It is remarkable how fast Weimar Germany recovered and regained economic stability after experiencing one of the worst episodes of hyperinflation in history. It provides hope that should we ever experience hyperinflation in the United States, it won't be the end of the world.